Hi. So by now you should have finished reading Chapter 7 from Knowledge, A Very Short Introduction. In this lecture, I'm going to elaborate on the ideas that were presented in that text and provide some more additional context about the way that contextual factors can influence our epistemic framework. So first, let's turn to an elaboration of what's covered in the text. Look at that little picture down there at the bottom of the circle. What you see there is called a painted donkey, sometimes called a zonkey, but that's a name used for a mixed breed between donkeys and zebras as well, so it can be a little bit misleading. Painted donkeys were a zoo attraction at some zoos in Tijuana for quite a while. They're less common nowadays than they used to be. And the idea was that you had this donkey and you painted it to look like a zebra. Now imagine that we're at the zoo together. We've gone on a class field trip to the zoo. And we're sitting there, and you say, "Oh, look, there's a zebra." And I say, "Oh, do you know that's a zebra?" And you go, "Yeah, look, it looks like a zebra. It's an equestrian quadruped, black and white stripes. Here's a sign that says zebra. It's a zebra." And I say, "Well, do you know it's not a donkey? A painted donkey, one painted to look like a zebra." And at this point, you're probably going to just be getting frustrated with me, right? Little do you know, I'm a closet skeptic or something, right? I'm coming to mess with you. But it does seem like, in some sense, you knew that this was a donkey, or was it not a donkey, right? That it was a zebra, right? You had a justified true belief, right? So this is actually a zebra. Let's just say this in the world really is a zebra. So you have a justified belief and a true belief until I brought up this weird thing about a painted donkey. And now your justification seems to be compromised somewhat. So the challenge of this chapter in your textbook is to deal with that fact, this seeming variation in how we treat knowledge across contexts. The first major approach here is what's called relevant alternative theory. Now, the relevant alternative theory says that you have to eliminate relevant alternatives for what your impressions are to qualify as being justified in your belief. So if you're at a reputable zoo and you know they don't have painted donkeys, right, and you look out there and you see an equestrian quadruped with black and white stripes, well, that is probably a zebra, right? And you're justified in saying that is a zebra. So you can qualify as having knowledge here. If we're at a less reputable zoo, or one where they say, hey, sometimes we throw in donkeys with painted stripes because why not? Well, now you seem to be in a somewhat more difficult position because there are more relevant alternatives. Go even further and imagine that we went down to Disney's Wild Animal Kingdom, right? That's the name of it anyway. And they have a bunch of zebras running around, and then they said, we've also put out some animatronic robotic zebras on the ground. Well, now that introduces a whole new level of relevant alternatives. So relevant alternative theory handles this context problem quite nicely in some sense. But it does have a very awkward conclusion, which is the violation of closure. So, you know that it is a zebra. And you presumably know that if something is a zebra, it is not a donkey. However, you do not know that this is not a donkey. Right. That is really weird. A basic logical rule, the basic logical rule of closure, should imply that deduction like this should work, right? If you know it's a zebra, then you should know it's not a painted donkey. But if that's not one of the relevant alternatives you've considered, then you don't really seem to know that, right? Because in fact it might be. This has led to some people looking for a more elegant solution. I want to note here that there actually is a pretty easy move here, which is to say that you don't know that if something is a zebra, it is not a donkey in this case, because what zebra means is contextually defined against relevant alternatives. And donkey is not one of the ones it contrasted against, so you can't actually make that claim. So there is a way to say relevant alternative theory here. But the next move is to what's called contextualism. Contextualism says that we have different standards for knowledge across different contexts, and the same standards for knowledge within a context. That is, it changes between contexts, and it's the same within one. Imagine whether or not you know that somebody, I don't know, was at a certain location, right? Do you know where your friend is right now? You know that your friend's out at a bar tonight. And then it turns out that something really bad happened at that bar. And the police come, they start asking you questions. They say, do you know where your friend was? Well, maybe you don't. Because maybe they went somewhere else. The stakes are now higher, the risks are now higher, and the context specifically demands that we have a more precise concept of what counts as knowledge. Everyday knowing can be very simple stuff, right? You know just because it's probable, right? It's justified. But when we talk about not knowing in like a legal sense, right? If you're in a courtroom and they ask you, do you know that? Or if you're in a laboratory as a scientist, they ask you if you know that. There's a different standard at play. Now, it's important to say that contextualism is a linguistic thesis. That is, it's primarily concerned not with what knowledge is, but with what the word knowing means. So we're talking about the truth of knowing claims changing from context to context because what counts as knowing differs from context to context. This distinguishes contextualism from our third view, interest-relative invariantism. For IRI theory, it's the stakes that influence whether or not something counts as knowledge. And these stakes determine whether it is knowledge, not just whether we can call it that, right? It's actually changing the nature of knowledge, not just changing the way we talk about it. Right? So clearly we change the way we talk about things across contexts, but maybe actually the thing itself is changing. So IRI is going to say that when you have something very much at stake, so when you're in the courtroom, you're going to need to use a different standard of knowledge here because the stakes change what counts as knowledge. Now, this is very similar to contextualism in some sense, right? They're both going to agree that you might not be right in saying that you know where your friend was if you get brought to court, because on the one hand, the contextualist is going to say that, well, knowing here has a different meaning. The IRI theorist, in contrast, is going to say, well, knowing means the same thing. It is sort of a relative position to having the proper amount of justification for the level of risk that you're dealing with. But the risk is different. So where contextualism is a linguistic thesis about the way we speak about knowing, IRI is about the concept of knowledge itself. That is, what counts as knowing and what is knowing differs from circumstance to circumstances as the stakes change. Take, for instance, a question of, do you know that there are no peanuts in a given candy bar? And I ask you that, and you're like, I don't really like peanuts. And you're like, are there any peanuts in this? And you're like, oh yeah, absolutely not. There's no peanuts whatsoever in it. And you hand it to me. And you're about to hand a same candy bar to a friend. So you're sure there's no peanuts in here because I'm deathly allergic to peanuts. And if there's even a touch of peanut, and I don't mean like it has to be a full peanut in the bar. I mean like if it was made in the same place as a peanut. Right? If it was in the same room as a peanut, I could die. Suddenly things seem to be very different. Right? Now you're going to go look at the back of the label. You're going to have to be more cautious moving forward. And this is because the changing interests have raised the stakes here, right? The stakes for one person who has this peanut allergy are much higher than for me, who might just not want a peanut right now. That's kind of weird, though. Things like, well, the waiter would have known that there weren't any peanuts in the food if it weren't for the fact that this was a person with a peanut allergy, and so now they don't know, they just believe very probably. That's weird. Now, you might just bite the bullet and say, all right, well, time to be weird. But some people take this as a reason to reject interest-relative invariantism. And many of these people push back to just general invariantism, which is either skepticism, that's the one we spent the most time on, or any other sort of invariant theory of knowledge. Invariant in this sense, by the way, means it doesn't change across contexts. But these theories seem to have difficulty accommodating the fact that the way we speak and think about knowing does change across contexts. So let's talk about some more issues with contextual knowledge. One thing that can happen is that our axioms and assumptions change from context to context. When we talked about foundationalism a ways back, the sort of basic level of justification, right, where you go down to the bottom and you say, well, I'm justified in virtue of this rock bottom principle. One of the alternate approaches is to say, well, in any given discipline, there are certain axioms you're justified in believing. In the scientific field, you're justified in believing that observation is a valid way of producing knowledge. That's just a justified belief in respect to scientific progress. This is another way that our claims about knowledge and claims about justification may shift from context to context. That is, what axioms we are allowed to assume may change. Now, again, this is going to have those same sort of weird consequences, where the same fact may count as both known and unknown, depending on the field that you're using, right? So this is actually not an uncommon issue for philosophy. You can think about this, that perhaps in philosophy, there are no axioms granted, or what axioms are granted are very minimal, right? Clearly, we allow the skeptic to play, so there have to be very, 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 very few axioms, if any. So things that would be taken as a given truth in, say, physics, that observation can generate truths about the world, are not going to be taken as a given truth in philosophy. And so that would be known and unknown. That's kind of funky. Another thing to point out about all of these approaches is that there is a dire need to define their key terms. What is a context? What is a relevant alternative, and how do we tell it apart from irrelevant alternatives? What is an interest, and how do our values change with respect to it? Many theories that deal with context work on this set of problems primarily. Right? They're trying to define these terms, but we don't need to get too far into that. What we do need to note, though, is that there's this sort of conflicting thing, right? On the one hand, it seems very intuitive to say that knowledge and knowledge claims change across context. But then when you apply it to a specific claim, it starts getting kind of funky sounding again, right? This is the waiter who knew there was no peanuts in the food until someone said they had an allergy. And he went, ooh, I don't know, let me go check. Right. On the other hand, we have this dire need to define these terms that the contextual theories are trying to use, these context-sensitive theories of knowledge. The big question to think about moving forward is, to what extent does a variation in context influence how we should think about and talk about knowledge, and how we should think about rational belief more generally? How much of this weighs upon context, or is there a way to describe rationality, knowledge, justification, and all of this in an invariant way that will adapt to these contextual intuitions? So that's all for today. And I will see you for our final lecture on Chapter 8 soon.